Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey. I was recently at the Canadian Institute of Steel Construction's conference here in Vancouver. I've got two interviews for you. The first is with Dan Leduc. He's from Norton Rose Fulbright. He gave a talk about prompt payment and how it's going in Ontario and the rest of Canada. And also, for the first time in a few years, you're going to hear crowd noise as background, which is a new but welcome development. So without any further ado, here's Dan. Dan just gave a presentation at the CISC, the Canadian Institute of Steel Construction's annual steel conference, which is live and in person for the first time in a few years. He gave a prompt payment presentation that was, of all things, funny. I didn't see that one coming. that was kind of a shock to me. Another thing he did was he gave sort of a summary of how things are in Canada. Some provinces have it, some don't. So maybe you can kind of give a little summation of what that was.
So the Ontario legislation has been in Ontario and active, and we've had prompt payment since essentially October 2019. It's grandfathered in, so it's taking more time, but now pretty much applies to each and every project in Ontario. You have the Saskatchewan legislation that is similar to the Ontario one that's been around for quite a while this year. You got Alberta that just came in at the end of August. So those are the ones that are currently acting legislation in Canada. You've got Manitoba that's coming, Nova Scotia that's passed but just hasn't been enacted, which we don't understand why. So it's slowly making its way. The unfortunate example is BC, where it seems to have reverted back. They've just said no. So all the lobbying, all the effort there is really just put us right back to starting point again, which is unfortunate.
You were pretty fulsome in how you explain things. You also gave explanations of some of the risks that people didn't see coming. One of them is people just don't use the tools they have available to them. So maybe you can speak to that.
Right. So you should understand and arrange yourself internally for whatever payment terms are going to apply to you. So if you're a subcontractor in Ontario, you should be expecting to get paid 35 days after that invoice, which is called the proper invoice, goes from the general contractor to the owner. You would know that generally from the terms of the prime contract, which will say it's either the 25th of the month or the end of the month and so on, and start being in tune to, if you're not getting paid in that 35-day window, why is that? And your ultimate recourse would be trigger an adjudication for payment or even a lien to secure the payment. But internally, you got to change your inner workings, accounting, and so on. Plus, you got to change your mindset to some degree, because the industry for the last 30 years has been so used to getting paid on 70, 80, 90-day terms that you've priced it into your estimates. You now understand that to be the cost of business, which I don't think is correct. We should be at net 30 days like every other industry. So that's what I mean by in terms of the adjustments that have to take place. Some are physical, internal, your accounting system and how you look at your receivables. The other is the mindset that has to go with that.
You also said you got into sort of the practical aspects of this, which I don't see a lot of. I usually cover the more esoteric government side of it. So one thing you said is that there used to be a conflict of interest when you had designers or engineers commenting on their own work, and now that adjudication has fixed that.
Well, it hasn't fixed it, but it allows you a better way of having a decision made, for example, on a change order, where instead of going back to the person who did the design and you're disputing the design or you're critiquing the design by saying, well, that you missed this or it conflicts with that or it's not coordinated somehow, and having that person who did the design make a decision. In my mind, that's a conflict of interest. They can't be a neutral decision maker on that. Now you can go to an adjudicator. You can get your decision, in 30 or 40 days on that very issue, and they're neutral. They have no link to either party or the project.
Another issue you talked about, you didn't name names, but you said some companies were so big that they were just kind of sitting on money and earning off of that instead of paying people out, and now they can't really do that anymore.
That's a presumption I made, that when you get into the volume of money that some contractors receive, and even if they sit on the money for 30 days and roll that through whatever investments they might have, it's still going to make money for them to sit on your money. Now that's gone with prompt payment. Hopefully it's gone, because it just doesn't make sense to me that they should sit on somebody else's money. But again, in Ontario, that should be gone, hopefully.
Another thing you observed is that there used to be people would leave and start their own companies
on maybe you'd see this maybe once or twice a year, and now it's a lot more because there's just more money flowing because people are getting paid on time. So I didn't say that right. You could probably legally explain that better.
Yeah, one of the downsides or unintended consequence of prompt payment has been it's a lot less expensive to start up your own construction company. So that credit facility you might need at the beginning is much smaller now. So one of the downsides is we're seeing a lot of middle managers go out and start their own companies and competing against their former employers. And then the issues that come out of that in terms of stealing opportunities and so on. But so that's one thing that nobody reflects on is your retainage policy and how you keep your people happy internally, because you're seeing a lot more movement, lateral movement, starting up their own companies now.
But I would assume them getting paid quicker also makes them happy. So.
Well, it does, yeah. But it's the downside to getting paid quicker. You might lose some of your people.
Right. And finally, just to kind of circle back to before, you've been told COVID, and it's probably legit, is one of the reasons it's taking longer for this thing to kind of roll into effect across the country. Now that we're hopefully over this, maybe, do you see this sort of accelerating, or are there other problems?
Yeah, I can't predict what governments are going to do. A change of government in the provinces. I really don't know what the delays have been, especially where it's been enacted, or has royal assent instead, but not enacted, like Nova Scotia. I don't understand what the delay. The federal government, there's the other one that I don't understand what the delay is, and I can't. If I understood why, I wouldn't be a lawyer. I'd be a political scientist at a university somewhere. So I can't help you too much there.
Oh, no problem. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Second interview I have for you is about the 410 Georgia Tower, which is a office building here in Vancouver that's got quite a unique look to it. Anthony El-Araj of Glotman Simpson and Dario Espi-Fournier of Canam both spoke about the construction and design of this interesting box-shaped tower. So here's that interview. And we're talking about 410 West Tower. That's the proper term for the building.
Yeah, Deloitte Summit.
If you've been to Vancouver, you've seen it. It looks essentially like a bunch of cardboard boxes. If cardboard boxes were mini high-rises, it's all stacked together. You have to see it to believe it, which audio isn't helping with. But maybe you could explain exactly, Anthony, first, how you pulled this off, because it is a unique-looking building.
Well, it always takes a lot of collaboration with ownership and the design team and ourselves, as well as the people executing the work. So we were fortunate to work with a great team, and we all came to a solution that seemed to make sense for the project. So a tough one, challenging one for everyone, but extremely rewarding as well, and kind of like an architectural masterpiece in downtown Vancouver. So something we're proud of. Yeah, we've certainly done a lot of steel. We have a lot of experience in steel. We were the firm that were the engineers on the convention center. So which wasn't a high rise. So yeah, steel high rises in this market are few and far between. Right. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. But this one definitely really was the only material to use, given the geometry and the complexity of these cantilever boxes. And then the central concrete core made sense as well from a scheduling perspective, because we were able to design that quickly, and they could start fabrication or construction of that ahead of the steel work that has a longer lead time from a design perspective and coordination, fabrication, installation. So I think the final structural system made a lot of sense, or materials made a lot of sense for this project. It was really the only materials that could be used, I think.
Speaking of steel, you explained tonight, you were saying you said there's pins in the system, and I thought, and then he showed us the pins, and they're 5-ton rods. So maybe you could explain how that worked, anchoring these cubes to the concrete core.
Yes, due to the nature of those boxes, cantilever, they need to be tied to the concrete core, so there's a actual load, tension compression, actual load, the diaphragm that need to go to the core, and those loads need to travel through a bunch of nodes. Then the use of a solid pin steel mass made a lot of sense to transfer all that load up to the core.
And you mentioned that the cranes had to be specially sort of also attached to the core because they couldn't go anywhere near the floor of the building.
So they had to be outside of the building, and on this building they could not be attached to the building itself. It was too much additional loading, so they had to build a completely separate structural system independent of the building to tie the core, tower cranes to the core.
And in fact, you had to build temporary steel to build these cubes in place and then make absolutely sure that they were kosher before they got attached.
They were at the right elevation, the proper camber, everything was set as per design, and then only then they were let loose to hang cantilever.
Okay,
Interesting.
and during the presentation, you basically, I don't know if you said this, but it sure came to mind, nothing about this was simple. Everything about it was complicated in some way.
Yeah, there's a lot of complex. It was fast-tracked from a design perspective. There were height limitations in downtown Vancouver, as we all know, and which, having steel framing made it more challenging because we had to squeeze everything into these tight spaces. Everything had to fit together perfectly, and then just the geometry of this. Every 4 levels having a completely different floor plate and all these heavy diaphragm drag loads back into the core. And the geometry of all that, just the load path alone, and then fitting it all together. It wasn't easy. There was no easy parts. The easiest part was the below grade parking structure, which was pretty typical. But as soon as you hit grade, it's a different story. Yeah.
And then you also pointed out that despite how complicated this all was, these are mostly open spaces.
Yeah, that's right. There are only 6. There's the core that runs continuous, of course, and then 6 columns that run continuous, which, for a floor plate of that size, that's pretty unique. And we were pretty happy with the structural framing system we proposed, because we think it kind of met all the building criteria as far as leasability of the spaces and maintaining the architectural vision. So.
And finally, you both covered the seismic, because this is Vancouver, where we have seismic problems. And at first glance, you would seem you'd need to do extra for seismic stuff. So did you have to do extra?
We did extra, absolutely. Fortunately, the geotechnical seismic parameters are very favorable in downtown Vancouver. It's stiff bedrock there, basically. So relatively low seismic loads for the local seismicity, and it's a light building because it's steel, not concrete. So the seismic stresses were not excessively heavy on their own, but when you combine that with the gravity loads, gravity-induced lateral demand it's called, the loads were somewhat heavy, but we took extra precaution. For instance, in the presentation we talked about the coupling beams that link the various seismic elements together. They were designed to not to yield at all, whereas the other elements, usually you design them to yield. So it took a little extra effort, but we're happy with the solution in the end. Yeah.
Okay, and from your point of view with steel, what were some of the things you had to account for seismic?
For seismic, the size of the elements, I would say, the nose and everything. In terms of fabrication and installation, I would give the designer all the credit for seismic on our side.
Okay, thanks very much for joining us, guys.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed these interviews from the Canadian Institute of Steel Construction's conference that was just held this week in Vancouver. If you'd like to hear more of the Construction Record podcast, you can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Music, and Amazon Music, or check us out on the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce websites. Thanks for listening.